Hey, this is PH and welcome to Good Bible Knowledge with PhD. In this set of videos, I want to provide a helpful and enjoyable way to understand common questions about the Bible. I hope you'll find these videos helpful for your own spiritual journey in Jesus. Let's get started. What is the significance of Israel in the Bible? The best way to answer this question is to go back to the origin of Israel as a nation. In Genesis 11, we are introduced to Abram and Sarah. Abram lived in Haran with his father, his brothers, and his nephew Lot. After the death of his father, Abram received a message from the Lord to follow him to a new land. At that time, God gave a lot of information. The one thing God didn't tell Abram was exactly where he was leading him. Abram, in a significant step of faith, trusted God's promises and followed him. Faith is acting in the present according to the future promises of God. It involves living not according to the physical situation around us, but according to the invisible yet very real presence of God. Trusting in God's promises was an ongoing struggle, and it wasn't long after arriving in this promised land that a great famine hit the region, and Abram and Sarai went down to Egypt to find refuge. Even after the famine was over, the land itself was not able to sustain both Abram and Lot's livestock, which had grown considerably since they arrived. God encouraged Abram not to focus on these physical setbacks, but rather to remember the promises of God. God sealed his promise by making a covenant with Abraham, which would come to be known as the Abrahamic Covenant. The Abrahamic Covenant was an unconditional promise of God, and it included three things. God promised that from Abram and Sarai would come a great nation, which would later be known as Israel. God promised that this land would forever belong to Abram and his descendants. And God promised that he would use Abram and his people to be the means by which God would bring his blessing to the entire world. For a long time, Sarai continued to remain childless, casting doubt in the minds of Abram and Sarai regarding the promises of God, and they foolishly decided to take things into their own hands. Abram had a child with Sarai's maidservant Hagar. Though this was a customary practice of the culture at the time, this was in violation of God's moral code, and Hagar bore a son named Ishmael. Despite their disobedience, God continued to keep his covenant with Abram. The sign of this covenant would be circumcision, and Abram and Sarai's names would be changed to Abraham and Sarah, and God promised that within a year they would have a son. And just as God promised, precisely at the moment he predicted, at the ripe old age of 190, Abraham and Sarah had a child, and they named him Isaac. The story of Abraham establishes the spiritual heritage of the nation of Israel. It was a reminder that their entire national existence was for God's purpose to remain a light that would draw every nation to God. Israel's religious practices would illustrate the holiness of God. Their political systems would advocate the sovereignty of God. Their faithfulness and even their unfaithfulness and rebellion would ultimately accentuate the need for a Savior. Everything about them was God's way of preparing the world for Jesus. Thanks for listening to another episode of Good Bible Knowledge. We'll see you next time.